300 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, there were perhaps 500,000 Christian hermits who'd chosen to live lives of extreme poverty here in the desert. They believed that by selling everything and fleeing from civilization, they were following the example and teaching of Jesus. But was this the way Jesus lived? Did he really want people to hide from civilization? In the silence of the desert, Muhammad, Moses, and Jesus all came face to face with God. Those who want to find stillness and quiet, rare commodities today, undergo the hardship of the desert, though nowadays on holiday. This group have come here to Egypt to visit the holy places of the Old Testament. I've come here to find the Jesus hidden for well over 1,000 years, the Jesus who is now coming to light.
We've all arrived here in the middle of the desert, so I just want to talk to you a little bit about what to expect and about how to stay well and healthy while we travel with the Bedouin. There is really only one danger here in the desert, one major danger, and that is the heat. And the biggest danger that comes with the heat is dehydration. So it is very important to drink little and often, but it is very easy in the excitement of the desert and seeing different things and living a different way to forget.
I've been to all sorts of lonely, wild places, and I love the scenery. I like to get away. I like the feeling of silence and being in a strange and wild country, really.
I do find the scenery fascinating and awe-inspiring. I always think it's the right place to meet God.
It was then a place of beginnings, and it's a place of beginnings all the time, and that, I think, is why Jesus went to the desert, as a place of beginnings where he could think things out from first principles. And it's also a place where, for example, the Dead Sea Scroll people went because they were fed up with the Jerusalem establishment. So they said, well, we'll go off to the Qumran and start again. So it's a place of new starts, of completely starting all over. And I think that's one of the important secrets of it. Some people say that God made the world and this is the place where he didn't quite finish. And that, I think, is also another, makes it amazingly interesting. It's that kind of dramatic thing which I think makes people naturally think of theological dimensions.
For 3 centuries, Christianity demanded courage. Christians were despised, persecuted, and martyred. But at the beginning of the 4th century, there was a reversal of fortune. Christianity became respectable. Martyrdom was no longer the highway to salvation. So Christians, seeking perfection, took the harsh road of loneliness and poverty in the desert.
A man came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus said, "You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these have I observed. What do I lack?" Jesus said, "If you will be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me."
Instead of confrontation with the Roman Empire, the Christian hermits drew up new battle lines. The conflict was now a spiritual one, a confrontation with nature and personal demons. These desert fathers embarked on an ascetic struggle, sacrificing everything in the name of Jesus. They believed that was the way Jesus had lived, that he too had been an ascetic. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley, was a leading center of trade and culture at the time of Jesus. The faith of the pharaohs still survived. Greek and Roman philosophy had arrived too, and so had Judaism. They influenced each other, making Egypt a cauldron in which ideas bubbled up and spilled over into neighboring regions. According to one of the Gospels, Jesus himself was brought here to escape the wrath of Herod. New evidence has been found in this ancient land which suggests that Jesus' teaching was not just based on his Jewish religion, that he could have been influenced by pagan faiths and philosophies too. Recent discoveries are now revealing clues to a Jesus different from the church's picture of its founder. This Jesus was opposed to institutions. He would have been an opponent of the church too. He called on his followers to seek their own salvation. He was a teacher of wisdom rather than a Messiah. The late 20th century doesn't seem to respond to the Jesus of the church, but the search for timeless wisdom does go on. Charismatic preachers, gurus, and God-men all flourish. We feel that the ancients had a knowledge of the purpose of life that we've lost. We do want a God who can fulfill our deepest spiritual needs. Christianity arrived in Egypt very early. The fledgling church wasn't the powerful institution it was to become. There were no grand buildings, no fixed dogma, no set rules, not even agreement on the contents of the New Testament. In the ferment of magic and mystery, faith and philosophy, there were deep divisions among Christians. Elaine Pagels is an early church historian who has studied the new evidence from Egypt.
There seems to have been conflict between Christian groups. There were those particularly who thought of Jesus primarily as Lord and Savior, the one on whom one must believe to be saved, Jesus whose death saves us from sin, who rose from the dead and so forth for our salvation, that view of Jesus. And others who tended to think of Jesus more as an enlightened being, one who pointed the way toward the discovery of the divine within oneself.
Who won out in this conflict then?
Well, we all know that the institutional church, with its insistence on orthodox teachings about Jesus, not only suppressed but attacked and pretty much annihilated memory of those whom they called heretics. I mean, the word heresy means those who made choices, and making choices was seen as a rebellious act against the institution that would become the church.
I wondered whether I'd find what those heretics believed about Jesus by following the route of the Desert Fathers into solitude and separation. The best known was St. Anthony. His biography, written by the Egyptian Bishop Athanasius, was a 4th century bestseller. It caused a sensation throughout the empire, with copies reaching as far as France. The life of Antony converted many pagans and launched the monastic movement. Christians, disillusioned with the church growing ever more rich and powerful, responded to St. Anthony's asceticism, extreme though it must have seemed even in his own age. Athanasius wrote of him, he was always fasting, and he had clothing with hair on the interior and skin on the exterior that he wore until he died. He neither bathed his body with water for cleanliness, nor did he ever wash his feet. After a long, hot journey, I've almost reached the world's first Christian monastery. It was founded by St. Anthony himself. He withdrew into the desert to protest not just against the world, but also against the church of his time. He felt that under imperial patronage, the church was becoming too fond of the good things of life. He told Christians they could not use the teaching of Jesus to justify worldliness. If they wanted to follow Jesus, they had to renounce the world and rejoice in poverty, not wealth.
Jesus said, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is easy and the way is wide that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few."
These desert monks believe they've gone through the narrow gate to follow the Jesus of the few, separated from the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil. They belong to the Egyptian or Coptic church, and they regard themselves as disciples of St. Anthony. These monks live very simple lives, centered entirely on work and prayer. It didn't take long for the church to order hermits to live in monasteries, hoping in this way to control their spiritual exuberance. But there was a conflict between the hermit's search for an individual Jesus and life in a monastic institution. After all, Jesus went into the desert on his own. He called his disciples one by one and taught each of his followers to call on God as his own Father. Although these monks live in a community, they try to imitate St. Anthony the Hermit as closely as possible. Like him, they follow Jesus' instruction to give up everything. Most of them could have pursued wealth and success in the world outside. Father Discourus was set on a career as an accountant.
We received the tradition from the oldest father, and the father received the tradition from the oldest and oldest.
And you feel they are still very close to you, although
Sure, they are buried in the cemetery in the monastery. From time to time, we went to visit them, and also to celebrate and remember them in our prayers. And we believe they are also pray for us in the heaven. We are in contact with them. Even they are far from us, but they spirit with us.
Today's monks see themselves in a long line stretching back to St. Anthony. His vision is their vision of Jesus, an ascetic who inspired individuals to heroic self-sacrifice.
St. Anthony is the first one who started to translate the teaching of the gospel to a practical life.
Do you believe that Jesus led a life of giving up everything, that Jesus was an ascetic?
Oh, yes. The first example for us, not as St. Anthony, Jesus Christ, I mean for the monastic life. If you see the life of the monks here in the monastery, it's the same as the life of Christ when he is on the earth. I mean, he was poor, like monks. He was living alone, but just he was serving people, I mean teaching people, like the monks till now. He was not interested in food and dresses and the mother thing. No, just he is living for the people. We can say that the monastic life, it's not new life, but just we are trying to live like Jesus Christ.
The monks have fled the world, but the world pursues them. Egyptian Christians travel miles to this remote monastery to seek their counsel and blessing. This is an old tradition. The curious and the troubled sought out Antony and the other desert fathers, hoping for words of wisdom.
Abba Moses, I have traveled from Sketis to find you in this wilderness. Give me a word from God that I may live.
My son, go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. Be at peace with your soul, and heaven and earth will be at peace with you. The ladder of the kingdom is hidden within you, within your soul.
The words of the Desert Fathers have reminded me how often Jesus taught in riddles and stories. He seems to have thought we should find answers for ourselves rather than trust the religious authority of others. He himself went into the desert of Judea alone to confront what for him was the great question: how to use his power.
Jesus was led by the Spirit for 40 days in the wilderness, tempted, and when they were ended, he was hungry.
And the tempter
The devil
said to him,
If
If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. And he said to him, All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me.
He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him.
The Gospel of Mark says that as soon as the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus at baptism, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness to be tempted by the Satan. And there it speaks of temptations which Jesus rejected, of power, political power, of sensual gratification, and so forth.
Are you saying that Jesus was an ascetic? Because after all, in the Gospels, he was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard.
Yes, it seems from the Gospels that he was not ascetic in terms of what he ate and drank, and certainly not scrupulous in terms of the food laws, as his opponents accused him of being very lax. But in regard to the greatest, enormous religious obligations of the Jewish community, which would be obligations to parents, to marriage, to children, those apparently he rejected. It was rather anomalous, as you know, for a rabbi to be unmarried and apparently celibate. And that, in that sense, Jesus seems to have renounced ordinary expectations, renounced the world of family and economic life.
In first-century Palestine, Jesus was an outsider, both in the way he lived and in his challenge to the establishment.
Jesus said, I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother.
To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God.
Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of. Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead.
Jesus' voice wasn't the only voice of dissent. The wealth and corruption of the temple in Jerusalem scandalized many Jews. Some even withdrew to the desert to live an ascetic life, which they believed was the Jewish tradition. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran, scholars thought they'd found the source of Jesus' asceticism. But as the scrolls were translated, it became clear that there were important differences between the Essenes, the Dead Sea community, and Jesus. The Essenes lived a settled life. Jesus wandered from place to place. They had a very strict code of conduct. Jesus was remarkably relaxed about rules. They didn't laugh. Jesus did. Perhaps Jesus got his ideas from an even stranger source. In his time, there were wandering teachers called cynics, who lived by the precepts of the Greek philosopher Diogenes. I remember learning about him as a schoolboy. He was the man who was famous for living in a barrel. The cynics believed the simpler the life, the happier it would be. Jesus said, "Take no thought for the morrow." So did the cynics. Jesus taught, "Consider the birds, they neither sow nor reap." The cynics suggested learning from the larks and the blackbirds. When Jesus sent out his disciples to preach, he told them to travel light.
These 12 Jesus sent out, charging them, "You receive without paying, give without pay. Take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves."
Jesus' instructions would have looked like a particularly severe version of cynicism, because they're not even allowed a staff to go with them. It's not a cloak, it's only a simple tunic that they're wearing, and they mustn't take a begging bag. But to go around like that, really sort of defenseless and ill-clad, would, certainly in many settings in the ancient world, have made them look like cynics.
Gerald Downing has looked at where cynic ideas might be found in Jesus' teaching.
In the insistence on poverty, on doing without riches, in the rude remarks he makes about people in authority, the so-called benefactors, the mannequins in the palaces, that kind of thing. In his wandering around, nowhere to lay his head, like the worse off than the foxes and the birds. On one occasion he's recorded as saying that the dead bury their dead. A very shocking thing to say in terms of Jewish tradition. There's one particular piece of Jesus' teaching, well known to many people. Consider the ravens or the crows. Consider the lilies or the anemones. There's nothing in Jewish tradition that encourages anybody to copy careless crows or improvident anemones. But we find this as a repeated theme in cynicism, that you act as the animals do without making provision for tomorrow. Very risky and very uncomfortable for any of us who claim to be Jesus followers today. But that's what he says. And that's very clearly what cynics say.
Although I'm unfamiliar with Coptic worship, I recognize what's going on. It's the sacrifice of the Mass, the Jesus who died for us and rose again and is now present in the bread and the wine. It's certainly not the cynic Jesus. I think he would have been suspicious of all this ritual. Did the Church hide evidence of the cynic Jesus? Did the Church write its own version of the life of Jesus, leaving out anything it disapproved of? Athanasius, the most powerful bishop in Egypt, certainly seems to have rewritten the history of St. Anthony. He portrayed the eccentric hermit as a valiant defender of Orthodox faith, a tradition which has passed down to the Coptic monks of today. But if you read between the lines, you find that St. Anthony was suspicious of bishops and was not too scrupulous about taking communion.
We have different traditions of Anthony, just as we do of Jesus. And you look at some of the sayings of Anthony and the other fathers, they sound quite radically individualistic as spiritual pioneers. But when you read Athanasius' version, Anthony becomes the champion of orthodoxy. He passes on literally his mantle to the bishop. He becomes the great Orthodox monk, the model which Athanasius wanted all monks to follow. And his followers to this day do that.
So you would describe that as a doctored version of Anthony's life, would you?
Perhaps that's the wrong, an impolitic word to choose. But many scholars have recently noticed how Athanasius shaped the image, if you like, of Anthony to turn him into the model Orthodox monk. Model by the bishop standards, that is, of course.
Perhaps the bishop shaped the image of Jesus too. We've known for a long time that there are sayings ascribed to Jesus that do not appear in the four Gospels approved by the Church. In the 19th century in Egypt, we first found fragments of those sayings.
I am the light. Lift up the stone. When you know yourselves, split a piece of wood. I am the fortunate are those who are alone children of the living Father, for you will find the kingdom.
The structures of early Egyptian Christianity collapsed. The manuscripts disappeared. So for centuries, we didn't understand how widespread the influence of the alternative sayings was. We only knew about the people who lived by these sayings from the writings of their enemies, the early church fathers. Then, in 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi, a remarkable library of Christian writings was discovered by chance. They were identified as being written by the Gnostics, Christians who believed they possessed secret knowledge imparted to them by Jesus himself. The writings depicted a Jesus in conflict with much of the teachings of the Orthodox Church. Marvin Mayer has translated some of the manuscripts.
Well, as far as we can tell, this is the spot where the Nag Hammadi library was discovered. It seems, as far as we reconstruct that story, that there were some camel drivers who hobbled their camels down below and walked up here digging for fertilizer and found the jar within which the Nag Hammadi library was discovered. Now, this library is such a significant library for us because of the fact that we feel very likely that this library might have been a part of the library of the monks that lived in monasteries in this area. And if that is the case, then it becomes very interesting as a moment in the discussion of orthodoxy and heresy during that time period. As we put things together, it seems quite likely that monks may have buried those texts here because these were suppressed texts. These were texts that Orthodox Christians were trying to get rid of, were trying to remove from the eyes of the faithful, and so the monks might have put those texts here to be safely stored away from their eyes. These texts are indeed remarkable texts. They contain many documents that are not found in the New Testament and yet are very important for our understanding of Jesus and the early church.
Among the discoveries were several new Gospels, one apparently by Mary Magdalene, one by the Apostle Philip, and the best preserved, a Gospel from St. Thomas the Doubter. The bishops condemned those who believed in these texts as heretics, but we now know the monks who preserved them did not regard themselves as outside the church.
If you'll notice, Mark, you see that on the wall there are examples of the opening lines of the Psalms in Coptic, and it must be that the Coptic monks used these opening lines for their meditation to remind them, really, of how the Psalms begin so they could recite that in their practices.
Sort of gave them a kick start.
Absolutely, yes.
A bit like we used to have in prayer books, where you had a couple of Latin lines about the Psalms.
Very much like that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh.
The leaders of the church apparently found it quite threatening that there were members of Christian communities who were going off on their own, often into the desert, often by themselves, on a solitary individualistic quest for spiritual discovery. And sometimes they were coming up with things that, say, the bishop didn't like. So that kind of spiritual exploration could be quite threatening to a bishop who is trying to unify the church community and gather that community under his authority.
We know that the church opposed the Gnostics because we have the writings of the early fathers. Do we know what the Gnostics' actual attitude to the church was? Were they enemies of the church? Were they opposed to the church?
It's a good question. The earliest sources suggest, as I said, that the writings, say, of the Gospel of Thomas was simply the supplementary, the more advanced teaching. But later, as people who loved these teachings were rejected by the church, they took on an antagonistic view. For example, I think if you were the leader of a small church that is struggling to survive against the enormous pressures of Roman persecution, there are some things you might prefer that Jesus not have said, if indeed he said them. For example, the saying from the Gospel of Thomas, number 70, in which Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Now that suggests you don't need a ritual, a priest, a church. You may not even need Jesus. You need to discover the resources of the divine, which are hidden deep within the human.
The Coptic Church did not welcome the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. The manuscripts were recognized as a challenge to Orthodox Christianity. Even after 50 years, they have not been published in Egypt. They're kept under lock and key in the Coptic Museum.
This is the Gospel of Thomas. These actually are 2 sheets from Book 2 or Codex 2 of the Nag Hammadi Library, and on the sheets are several pages that come from the Gospel of Thomas. You see here, Mark, is the last page of the Gospel of Thomas where the title is given, Puangelion Pakata Tahomas, the Gospel according to Thomas. That title is given at the end of the text, and there is another kind of a title, an earlier title given at the beginning of the text. These are the hidden sayings of the living Jesus. And this is the very remarkable text that may tell us a great deal about the historical Jesus and what his significance was in the early church.
These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas Thomas the twin recorded. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings shall not taste death. When you know yourselves, you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. Fortunate are those who are alone and chosen, for you will find the kingdom. For you have come from it, and you will return there again. Jesus said, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all has come forth, and to me all has reached. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there."
But what we see in the Gospel of Thomas is a particular kind of literature. It's a sayings text. We call it a sayings gospel. That is to say, it is a gospel that has sayings of Jesus without any particular narrative context. Typically in the New Testament Gospels, what we have is a Jesus who is setting his eyes toward Jerusalem, who is on the way to the cross. Not so in the Gospel of Thomas. In fact, there is only one reference in the Gospel of Thomas to the cross, and that is in the context of a proverb, that you have to bear your cross, that you have to bear your burden. That's the only reference to the cross. There's no reference to the resurrection whatsoever. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus seems to function as a homeless kind of wanderer who is wandering with a few men and women around him, asking provocative questions about God's reign and God's rule, not defining it, but telling stories about it, stories that are sufficiently open to allow those around Jesus to try to find God in everyday life around them. That may be, in fact, rather close to the historical Jesus in many ways of thinking about him, and that portrait thus in the Gospel of Thomas may prove to be a very significant one for us as we try to think of who Jesus as an historical person might have been.
This Jesus has great appeal for me. He's rather like an Indian guru. He doesn't ram dogma down my throat. He encourages me to find God for myself. I don't think he'd even ask me to belong to a particular church or recite a specific creed. I think he may well be the Jesus of the next millennium. The Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas was so provocative that the early church tried to suppress him. But I wonder whether Jesus would have survived at all if the church hadn't been there to preserve his memory. This ancient monastery of St. Catherine in the desert below Mount Sinai stands as a symbol of the church, the fortress protecting the Christian faith from its enemies. The Greek Orthodox monks have protected and preserved some of the most precious New Testament manuscripts. But some would argue that the church has protected Jesus by locking him up in a gilded cage. Has the church destroyed the Jesus who teases us with riddles and put in place a remote, distant God? A God whose light doesn't guide us to wisdom, but blinds us with fear? A Jesus risen on high rather than a Jesus reborn in our hearts? It became a test of orthodoxy to accept a literal view of the resurrection.
It seems that within the New Testament, Christians could sustain the ambiguity and say, well, it happened this way, maybe it happened this way. What we know for sure is that the one who died is somehow alive. By the 2nd century, some of the fathers of the church said, if you don't believe that the body got out of the grave in 3 days, you're not on our side. And what struck me when I was curious about that is that it seemed to be important to establish who was really connected with Jesus. That is, if you had seen him out of the grave, and he was only available in that form for 40 days, according to Luke, then you were truly a member of the initiated elite of the church. And ever since the beginning, to the days of the present popes, the leaders of the church have claimed that their authority derives from Peter, the first witness of the resurrection.
So the resurrection, in a way, was crucial to the authority of the church.
Indeed, if you look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example, one of the Gnostic texts that was found, Peter asked her, you know, well, where did you get these things? And she said, well, I saw the Lord in a dream last night, and he said to me, and he stops her and says, what do you mean you saw him in a dream? Because if you could see the Lord in a vision, you could see him today. People do, of course. And what you see could surpass the revelation of the church. And that is enormously threatening. Then you have any possibility of any wild-eyed, you know, prophet out of the desert coming with a new revelation from Jesus.
The resurrection is the most important, yet the most difficult teaching of the church. The monks of St. Catherine's are so confident they will rise again that they live with a stark reminder of death. The skulls of their predecessors stored in the monastery charnel house. But for most of us, belief in the resurrection does present great difficulties. It has done since the very earliest days of Christianity, as St. John tells us in his Gospel.
Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will not believe." Jesus came and stood among them, and said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God."
I find it fascinating that on the one hand, St. Thomas's Gospel does not appear to mention the resurrection and doesn't appear to take the resurrection very seriously. And yet in St. John's Gospel, we had this story of Thomas being one of the very few people who literally touched the resurrected Jesus.
Yes, actually, new research suggests that the Thomas tradition was that Jesus was alive after he died in some form that is incomprehensible and never stated. But that the Gospel of John, which depicts Thomas as the great doubter, you know, the one who's got to be convinced by physical touch, that is a polemic against the Thomas Christians who maintained a different and perhaps more mysterious view of resurrection.
So it was a story added by John, really, in a way, to discredit Thomas in some ways?
Today, many scholars are suggesting that the Gospel of John is intended to attack this Thomas perception of Jesus and his resurrection.
Now, the four Gospels which got into the New Testament, which were accepted by the Church as the New Testament, do they in some way reflect the Church's concern about authority?
The question was certainly one of authority, but it would be wrong, I think, to think of this as some Machiavellian power ploy on the part of the bishops to consolidate their power. Actually, to be a bishop in the 2nd century meant that one was a target of persecution. And the Romans, I mean, often the first one to be arrested, tortured, and executed would be the bishop. The bishops were actually trying to ensure the survival of a very fragile movement.
Christianity has survived through the Church at a price.
Yes.
What has been lost, do you think?
Before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, you would think that all that had been lost was nonsense and gibberish and blasphemous garbage. But now we realize that these are in fact mystical traditions. They're traditions about internal contemplation. I think they're spiritually powerful and profound in many ways, where it's not a question of believing in Jesus simply, but finally becoming Jesus.
The pilgrims have now spent several days in the desert, the place where so many before them felt they'd met God. Some of them are finding a more direct experience of God than they found at home.
I think the whole thing becomes prayer. It's not a matter of words in particular times, but being aware of God's presence, which again you can do at home very easily, but it comes more easily here.
There are absolutely no distractions. It's just you and your thoughts and the vastness of this incredible creation.
The asceticism of these pilgrims doesn't match St. Anthony's, judging by their dinner. But I'm reminded that Jesus liked a good meal too.
There we go, that looks absolutely terrific.
Big comparison there compared to butter. I'm not sure whether it's a place to be in touch with God. I think it's more a place where you're in touch with yourself. And then whether you feel the need to think about God or whether you sort of become more at peace with yourself. That's a personal thing.
I couldn't leave the desert without ascending Mount Sinai, where God gave the 10 Commandments and the prophet Elijah heard the still, small voice. At all times and in all places, people have worshipped God. It's only in the brief history of the secular West that religion has become a minority interest. I began this journey trying to find out whether the claim that Jesus was human and divine would survive yet another millennium. I started in India, where I learnt from the parallels between Hinduism and Christianity that we all worship the same God. But that undermines the Christian claim that Jesus is the only way, the only Son of God. In Israel, that claim was also challenged by scholars I met, who suggested that Jesus might have been quite an ordinary person, just another Jewish preacher perhaps, or maybe a minor irritant to the Roman Empire. Now here in Sinai, I find historical evidence of the extraordinary influence Jesus can exercise. That is a fact, whether Jesus is divine or not. The Desert Fathers teach me that the countless Christians who have lived heroic lives have done so because they have let Jesus live in them. Moses met God on this mountaintop, and the climb to get up here symbolizes the ascetic struggle and the mountains we have to ascend if we're to find Jesus for ourselves and not just accept the Church's teaching. But there's a danger in this spiritual search. All the scholars I've spoken to have warned against creating Jesus in our own image, a Jesus who is not rooted in history. I was once a firm believer in Jesus and wanted to be a priest in the Church of England, but I found I was more at home in the pub than the pulpit. Thanks so much, Church. Working as a journalist, my faith ebbed away. I was afraid that this journey would finally end Christianity for me. But back where I still feel at home, I find I'm once again fascinated by the figure of Jesus. I've been reminded that whatever happened during his lifetime, after death he became the man accepted by almost all as the most important figure of the last 2,000 years. But that man was probably a failure in his own lifetime. That's what I've learned from the historians. He didn't prophesy correctly. He taught in strange riddles. He didn't convince his fellow Jews, and he didn't overthrow Rome. From that failure, I've come to what for me is the most important conclusion of all, that the hardest, apparently least historical article of Christian faith, the resurrection, must have happened. If there'd been no miracle after Jesus' death, there would have been no grounds for faith in a failed life, no resurrection, no church. What exactly happened, we may never know. But I now believe that if Jesus' companions were prepared to die for their faith in the resurrection, there's no historical reason why we shouldn't live in that faith.
Sunday in ETV on TV1, we continue Disabilities, the program that gives us an insight